All right, welcome everybody. Worldview Conversation Cafe, focusing on the manager and performance management with this question: why aren't your performance conversations working? We've had a wonderful opening that isn't in the recording, with delegates sharing a little bit about their feelings about what's happening in the organizational world, both in South Africa and globally, and to some extent lamenting the state of many organizational performance standards at the moment. And we use some South African cases to talk about that. So this is in the context of our 2026 theme, which is practical management. And when I thought about the elements of practical management that we've put in our practical management program, strategy, obviously, managers are involved in strategy formulation or execution, organizational design, setting up the structures and the patterning of organizational life, organizational change, organizational leadership, and leading and working in teams. Performance management touches on every one of those areas. So they're all green. Because performance management is a part of practical management in every aspect of practical management. The Worldview Conversation Cafes are a thinking space, not so much a teaching space, although we do share some content with you. But it is a shared investigation. And if you're watching this recording, you hopefully will see delegates popping in to ask questions or comment. To get us going on performance management, I wanted to share some of the things I was thinking about when I was building up to this cafe. So if the underlying question is, why are the performance conversations not working? Why does there seem to be some kind of accountability issue? These are the broad range of concerns that I had. The first one, which I dive into a little bit more deeply in a second, is the level of care or accountability that is actually required in a performance conversation. We're inclined to think of performance management as a process. And I was reflecting on just how much the manager is called upon, and the employee or whoever you're having the performance conversation with is called upon to demonstrate care, to care about, on the one hand, the unit or the company and its work, to care about the work that they're doing, and on the other hand, to care for each other, to take an interest in how that person is doing, going about their work. And that's kind of an emotion, you know, this idea of care. It's not a technical process adherence. It's a psychological state. Do you care? And if you've been attending Worldview Cafes for some time, you know that we are quite curious about the correlation between the duty of care and quality. So there's something going on with the amount of care that is required. Then, of course, there's this idea of the process itself. So there's a relationship between various approaches to performance management and the level of complexity that the unit or the organization experiences. So again, you know, a worldview approach to thinking about complexity is the Cynefin framework, simply dividing the organizational world into simple, complicated, complex, or chaotic states. And the question of, is your performance management process appropriate for the level of complexity that you're facing in the organization? And it may be that complexity levels are rising and simple approaches or standardized approaches to performance management don't work. And so we might be asking managers to execute processes that are built for more reliable and stable states in organizational settings that are not reliable and not stable. The third thing I was thinking about was structural enablement of performance. You know, it's very difficult to ask someone to compete effectively in a race where all of the other competitors are on motorcycles and the person you're managing has a bicycle. The person on the bicycle would not be able to keep up with those on motorcycles. And this is an oversimplification. A story I shared with some of the delegates about my experience of traveling through the Bike Bridge border post, where on the Zimbabwean side of the border, there's a very effective digital process in play. So it's reliable, it's digital, human beings being processed through the border post that carry a barcoded slip and they move through the stations. It's clear that everybody working at that border post understands which step of the process they're in, and that there's some sense of trying to move people quickly through the process. On the South African side, there is no digital system. And so it might, you know, there's just a simple comparison of having a good structural support, weak structural support, and the knock-on consequences on performance. So whether it's a local council, a municipality, a diamond mine, whatever it might be, you know, to what extent have we structurally enabled performance before we start looking at human performance in that context? And then we get these contrasts starting to pop up. So we've talked a little bit about care. To what extent do I care about the organization, and to what extent do I care about the work, and to what extent do I care about people at all? I don't know whether it's relevant, but as a step aside, I'm rereading Biko and his thoughts on consciousness. I'm not reading Biko just out of curiosity. I was thinking about my children and their identities. And I was reading Biko to see if I could find in his philosophy a different take on identity and consciousness. And there's such powerful writing here about care and what it is that we care about. Then, of course, you've got the contrast between, in some organizations, we see the problem where individuals are being rated in performance conversations highly. So they're getting very good performance feedback and getting compensated off that performance rating. But the unit itself is not performing at all. So the unit performance is terrible, but individual performance conversations are all being rated highly. So there's clearly something going wrong there, either in the performance process or in the level of care that's being applied to the process, or some fear of conflict, or some fear of telling the truth. And I was sharing in relation to a story that Dumisani and Timbela was telling, some work that I did in several settings around South Africa where fear was the dominant emotion. Fear of retribution, fear of being ostracized, or fear of being harmed. And fear doesn't work really well in a performance conversation. It would be a significant block to a good performance conversation. Then we get organizational form. So those of you who attended our organizational design discussion a couple of months back know that we think about organizational form in various ways. You know, all the way from Joan Woodward's 1958 classifications of organizations that do unit or bespoke production to batch manufacture or batch production or process production. So in a continuous process, like a border post is a continuous process, and maybe a project software development house is a unit production organization. And does the manager fit the form? Does the subordinate fit the form? Or are we trying to draw experience from one form and use it in performance management in another? In something as simple as, to what extent does a manager prepare for a performance conversation, or just walk in and dump? Do the subordinates prepare? And then ultimately, I started to think about psychological capital. And I'll explain a little bit what I mean by psychological capital in a second if you haven't come across the term before. But on the one hand is the managerial psychological capital with regard to good performance management, and the subordinates psychological capital with regard to good performance management. So what the slide captures is a glimpse into just how many variables there might be in trying to answer the question, why are performance management conversations not working well? And why aren't they producing the outcomes that we hoped for? And I'm sure that as I'm talking, you're thinking of other factors, or you've thought about other examples. I'm not going to take us through the breakout on this. I'm just going to start taking you into what might be a solution, and then we'll chat about that in a little when I'm done. So what I thought was, maybe we could discover what might work for you, or we could discover what might be a problem for you by exploring some kind of general method of improving performance management conversations. Because it seems that what doesn't work is long HR policy explanations, rating calibration debates, detailed KPI design work, or dramatic role plays, legalistic language, getting more and more committed to the kind of technical side of performance management, psychometric overload, competency framework teaching. I've seen organizations doubling down on these techno-structural approaches to performance management, and they don't seem to be working. They don't seem to be shifting the dial at all. So I thought, what would happen if we focus on the manager's emotional state and their engagement with accountability conversations? What helps there? And maybe it's psychological capital. So if you make the assumption that managers are resisting good quality performance conversations because they anticipate conflict, so there's that fear piece coming through. And I don't want to in any way downplay the reality of the fear. We need to acknowledge that we're in a space where retribution can be physical. People do fear for their lives and for their jobs in some of these performance conversations. They might anticipate relational damage. By what right do I as a manager have to speak with you about your performance? And I was thinking about that on a plane yesterday while I was reading Biko, and Biko's talking about what it means to be an African and the importance of putting a person, in Biko's words, putting the man at the center. I mean, he was writing a while ago, at the center of everything. So to put our relationship at the center before we talk about performance. So relational damage might be a fear. Managers might also resist because of standards ambiguity. You know, it sounds so easy to say, let's just figure out what good looks like and then talk about why we're not there yet. But interpretations of what good looks like require considerable effort and need some conversation in many cases to try and align on what we mean by good and what good looks like. Managers might fear failure, both in the relationship, in the outcome of the performance conversation and in general. And so there's a chance that they might just be hiding away. You know, if I don't put my head up, as one of our delegates said, if I don't stand out and start speaking, if I could just hide, I might be able to get away with things for longer. Obviously, emotional discomfort. Very few people find it easy to sit down and talk about somebody else's performance. And then this political exposure. Political, not necessarily in the sense of national politics, but political in the sense of organizational power dynamics. And we get this sense of, you know, the person I'm performance managing might be sponsored by some other powerful person or my boss or whoever. And so stepping into a discussion about performance can be politically exposing. So how could you reduce managerial threat perception? How could you increase confidence and perceived capability, create practical experiences, and then reframe performance management as human and developmental rather than punitive? And psychological capital seems to me to be an underplayed or underused way of thinking about this. I have tested this in a few spaces over the last few months, in fact, over the last 6 or 7 months. And there seems to be a lot of discussion about psychological safety and not as much use of psychological capital. So as a reminder, Luthen pulled together these constructs to create psychological capital, and it can broadly be defined as a measurable store or a state of mind, influencing whether people feel capable. Do I feel like I can do this? Capable of contributing or adapting or persisting or engaging constructively in some behavior. So, you know, like the SWOT analysis in strategy, a SWOT analysis is not just done generally, it's always done in relation to something. We do a SWOT analysis to see if we could be good enough to enter a new market, or a SWOT analysis to see if we can launch a new product. You'd think about psychological capital in relation to something specific, like what's your store of psychological capital towards the idea of exercising or becoming a salesperson or succeeding in cross-cultural relationships, or in this case, in having great performance management conversations. And psychological capital particularly comes into play under pressure or uncertainty or in times of change. So how do we build psychological capital, and how might you apply it to performance management or improving performance management conversations? Generally, it is demonstrated, it's proven that you can run a small workshop specifically designed around the elements of psychological capital that will reliably build psychological capital, and that effect will last for months without further reinforcement. So psychological capital is a state. It's a state independent of our natural psychological traits. So again, in whatever the way you think about personality, we like to use the Enneagram. What this is saying is that it doesn't matter what your Enneagram type is, or your Myers-Briggs profile is, or your strengths profile is, irrespective of all of that, a workshop designed to build psychological capital generally seems to work well. And the process is prime the room, so get people's minds into the space that you're trying to work on. That could be exercise, it could be cross-cultural relationships, and it could be performance management. And then you run through very deliberately the 4 elements of psychological capital. And these are to build hope, to build a sense of self-efficacy, to build resilience, and to build optimism. So it's a nice acronym. Luthen's HERO is the acronym that he had: hope, efficacy, resilience, and optimism. Each of them is testable. So you can run approved in the South African context. You can run accepted by the Health Professions Council tests to see what the state of confidence, hope, optimism, and resilience are in relation to any kind of objective. I've given you a reference on the deck, which is one of many studies using this kind of approach, this kind of workshop. And what's nice about this is that Johann Potgieter is a UCT, or was a UCT academic at the time, and Reichardt was at, I think, Columbia, and they collaborated on using PsyCap to create cross-cultural psychological capital and its relationship with cultural intelligence and ethnocentrism. So let's have a look at what that might be. And as I do this, again, colleagues, the invitation is to critique what I'm saying, to think about what you might want to do more of or less of or differently if you were applying it in whatever setting you're in. So let's imagine a workshop called Managing Performance with Confidence that is set up for half a day, so 3.5 to 4 hours. And we're going to run 7 mini conversations in there, or facilitate 7 stages. First is to make it salient. So we'll have an opening discussion around what makes performance conversations difficult. We'll try to reframe performance management. We'll think about the manager's sphere of influence. We'll practice some small performance conversations without too much drama or theater. We'll think about managing emotional reactions because we're afraid of these things, and then create some kind of cadence for having performance conversations, and then wrap up with a closing commitment. Could this significantly change the way performance conversations are being done? Well, obviously we'd need a bit more detail. So let's go through it in some detail. So in the opening discussion, you kick off with a kind of a 1, 2, 4 all. So for those of you who are familiar with the liberating structures in facilitation, the 1, 2, 4 all technique is really just think on your own, talk to somebody next to you, combine into groups of 4, debrief to plenary. And we know that that process creates a little nest of psychological safety and can open up discussion. And what we're looking for is for the managers in the room, and we do want intact groups of managers, ideally, or I suppose it could also be managers from different organizational settings, to share difficult experiences, to open up about their anxieties and frustrations, to reveal whatever their avoidance patterns are, and ideally to share positive experiences. We want to draw on some of the hotspots or spaces where it might be working. And the PsyCap focus in this opening is to prime the room, generate the psychological safety, and quite importantly, to normalize the difficulties of a good performance conversation. We definitely don't want to lead with the sense that this is easy, and if you can't do it, there's something wrong with you. We want to flip that around and lead with, this is quite difficult for many people, and it's okay. Let's be comfortable with the fact that you might have a whole range of different reasons for avoiding doing this well. And then we move smoothly into reframing performance management. So here, the facilitator does need to give some input. So a small presentation or a talk on performance management as human and organizational care, as a demonstration of love almost. But that if you love the organization and you love the work and you have genuine love for human beings and humanity, leaning towards trying to make people better at what they do and the way they go about it is a positive thing. To think about performance management as clarity seeking and meaning making. How do we make sense of what we're facing, and how do we cut through the noise to define what good looks like? Performance management is coordination, to try and get people to get together to do things well. Performance management as development, development of the organization's performance, development of South Africa in general, and development of one human being, one person who reports to that manager. Development of support networks. So this is that idea of performance management as performance enablement. Of once we've agreed that we're not quite at a certain standard, how can I help you? How do I help you get there without over-parenting you or without doing your work for you? How do I support you in your growth as you get there? Performance management as standard setting. And you know, I'm reminded of a conversation I had with one of my kids once, where he said to me, you know, Dad, I'm doing my best here. And I said to him, my boy, I've lived a very long time, and I know that you're not even aware of what your best looks like yet. So let's try and reimagine what your best is, and see where that gets us. And he's now 30, so he reminds me of that a lot. And that performance management is not merely discipline and not HR compliance. It's a human-to-human relationship of development. And then run a mini exercise. What does performance management feel like when it's done well? And again, back to the 1, 2, 4, because you'll see in this approach that we're dealing with the emotions of the managers, and that's not going to come out through some teacher speaking or some HR person lecturing on what the process is. This is managers exploring each other's thoughts and feelings about something. And here the PsyCap outcomes are hope and optimism. Psychological capital, hope is a plan-based sense of hope. So when you dig into the construct that has been pulled into psychological capital, it is hope in a plan, hope that this approach will work. It's not just blind optimism, although optimism is there, a belief that tomorrow could be better, suddenly a glimpse that we could do this better, I could do this differently. And then, of course, to generate some meaning and some positive reframing around people's emotions. Then we move into a discussion about the manager's sphere of influence. And here what we want to draw out is people saying, you know, my structural context doesn't allow me to performance manage well, or, you know, I don't feel accountable for this stuff, or we want to try and distinguish these accountability, enablement, system constraint, employee ownership conversations. Am I my employee's keeper? And so in the exercise, we want managers to identify what they can control, what they can influence, and what they cannot control in team performance, and then develop these plans to start to overcome obstacles, working with and talking to other managers similar to them, rather than listening to some plan that's being pushed at them from HR. Again, the psychological capital focus is hope, resilience, agency, thinking, and reduced helplessness, starting to draw on simple, and we're definitely not looking for earth-shattering things here, just simple, practical approaches that managers can start to take, given whatever constraints they're working in. shift again to practice. So short paired role plays on very specific topics. So a recognition conversation. When we do the positive part of performance management and call somebody out directly for something that went well, how do we do that? A missed expectation conversation where the manager expected one thing and something else happened. A support conversation where the manager's leaning in to say, how can we help? And a reset conversation where we have to stop, rethink, maybe re-clarify. With very simple rules, let's have this conversation, low theater, very short cycle, and then immediate peer reflection. So we're back to the managers talking to each other, saying, I noticed when you did that, what about trying this? And then move to the next one. And in these quick cycles, just practicing. Because we know as facilitators that even as I'm watching, I'm imagining how I might do this. And so the learning is quite deep. PsyCap focus, of course, is self-efficacy, the belief that I can do something. I believe in myself. I believe that I can make a difference. Behavioral mastery, so through practice, and confidence through practice. And then again, we have to go and deal with some of the emotional stuff. Now, we want to surface, now that we're further down the conversation, we do want to surface fear of conflict, fear of damaging relationships, any avoidance patterns, any defensive employee reactions where the employees stonewall or sidestep, and then this now personality-based tendencies of overreaction or underreaction. The Enneagram 8s leaning in and maybe the Enneagram 9s stepping back from the intensity that can start to build in these in a good performance conversations. And that's an input session. Again, the facilitator needs to be able to put these on the table and surface them, and then move into a discussion. What happens when conversations are delayed for too long? I'm not sure if that's exactly the right topic for that breakout conversation, but you can play with what that discussion is that allows people to start to process, how do we deal with these fears and anxieties and avoidances and defensiveness that we might get. And here the PsyCap focuses on resilience, on emotional tolerance, and a recovery orientation. And now we've really worked through each of the elements that could surface in any organizational setting. What's actually causing a problem here? Is it systemic? Is it emotional? Is it power dynamics? Is it whatever else might come up? Somewhere in the 5 steps we've taken so far, we've been able to surface, normalize, and start to process how we might approach them. And then we can close out, get close to the ending by setting up a simple rhythm of accountability. This is the obvious exercise. So each manager drafts and maybe shares their weekly, monthly, quarterly performance habit. And we can give some examples, do a weekly check-in, monthly coaching session, quarterly expectation reset. And here again, we're building hope because it's based on practical plans. So instead of hoping based on nothing, I can hope my plan might make a difference, build behavioral consistency, and it's a very practical implementation that managers can share with each other. And then close with each manager reflecting on one performance conversation I should stop avoiding. So which is the conversation that I haven't been having that I should? And then this very powerful idea of accountability partner sharing. So trying to hook up with a friend or a person like you and And the two of you are going to try and work on this together, supporting each other as managers in the field, not as HR supporting a manager. And here we focused on commitment, action orientation, and transfer into the workplace. Well, colleagues, that's what a very quick outline of a proven approach, which is psychological capital, used in relation to trying to surface and think about and deal with the real issues that managers might be facing in pretty much any organizational setting, and to allow for the promise of the psychological capital workshops that, if done well, if that works, the effect is quite long lasting, that you, without constant reinforcement, psychological capital has been measured to remain high for several months after these workshops. And then what we hope for is that by positive feedback, that they seem to be getting a better result in these conversations, that it sustains. The map onto the HERO framework, HERO being hope, efficacy, resilience, and optimism, is that the workshop does clarify pathways and clarifies managerial influence. Several people I talk to have a belief that we've been degrading management, that we're becoming more and more and more focused on process and system and on the disempowerment of the manager, to the extent that actually sometimes it's considered an insult to say that person is a manager. People would prefer to be called a leader or a, something else, an influencer maybe, but not that manager has become a bit of a swear word. And we want to maybe reimagine that in some way. The workshop also practices the conversations, and it practices it all the way through. It's not just in the role play session. You're practicing conversations about performance management all the way through, which builds efficacy. You are normalizing the emotional difficulty, and you're normalizing the kind of recovery cycles that you need to take after each of those setbacks, which builds resilience. And then reframing performance management as developmental and useful can build optimism. The case for simplicity, as opposed to this heavy-handed, competency frameworks and stronger processes and so on, is that these short interventions can produce meaningful effects when they include peer reflection, reframing, mastery experiences, peer learning, and practical application. Well, that's the trigger. I offered it to spark something in you. I'd like to give you a minute just to maybe with a piece of paper or in your head, just to think about these two questions. What aspect of that kind of approach resonates most for you, in positively or negatively? You might be looking at it thinking, I've seen that before, it just doesn't work. Or yes, I think that's something that might work for me. And what would you emphasize, add, or remove? Take a moment before we open that up for conversation. I'll give you about 30 or 45 seconds to think about that. All right. If you have something to say about this, what would you say? Thanks for hearing me out. Lawrence, you've unmuted, so welcome, you're in.
I was involved for probably the best part of 20 years plus with performance management. I think it's a very noble approach that you want to develop leaders to understand this better. However, we've tried it numerous times to get people actually to be committed to this. After a couple of years out of the business now, I think the wisdom that comes with age and years of experience is that it started off with selecting the wrong people in the leadership management positions. They are technical managers. They don't care a damn about managing people. As a matter of fact, they manage they manage people the same way they'll drive nails into a plank. They use a hammer. And that's the only tool they have. That's the only tool they know. We've tried numerous times, even with deep psychological counseling and therapy with some of them. We just couldn't move them. Yes, there were successes, there were changes, I have to agree. But it starts off with it's like panel beating a car or a Volkswagen Beetle to look like a Porsche. It's just practically, you can get more or less something, but it's never going to be a Porsche. So that's the first thing I think the assumption is wrong, or the assumption that I think you have is that all managers or most of them are selected because they're good leaders. And I think that's a mistake. So maybe go back to the drawing board on that and make sure that whoever is in that group are actually people who are inclined, maybe not the best technical managers, but they are people leaders. That, and then the second thing is that I just want to add to this is that the workload of managers or leaders currently, with the overemphasis on admin, you have to report on everything. You have to write reports. You have to do inspections, and everybody is CYBS, cover your backside. So top management comes down like a ton of bricks with all managers down in the hierarchy. And I've experienced it, and I often see it now with one of the smaller companies I'm consulting from time to time, is that the workload is so that the poor workshop manager says to me, well, he's actually, in my view, is more of a foreman, but they call him a manager. He says, I don't have hands. I have to take up tools myself. Where the heck do I get time now to go and sit with my 3 or 4 mechanics that are working with me to have conversations with them? He says the only language we understand is I hit him harder with a spanner. Well, first of all, I think he's the wrong person in that job, but time-wise, it's just impossible to get to all of this. I think what resonates with me is the effort. I think there's always, as from a human perspective, I think there's always reason to, and it's noble and it's good and it's always pursued to develop people, but then you need to develop the right people, otherwise it's futile. And if you miss with this and people see but there's not much change, then your program actually gets shut down. And I think, yeah, emphasizing or adding or remove, I don't think there's anything that you in your program that need to be removed or added. Well, just from I know the Enneagram is approved, but I think there are better projects for your purpose. I strongly suggest you speak to somebody like Johan van Zyl. He's got the leadership circle. Excellent tool, excellent. I've done it numerous times. It's comprehensive and something that it's scientific. It's much better scientifically based. Or well, it's well scientifically based on and the results has proven itself over years. And there we found many people, they lean so strong towards the technical side that even with enormous effort, you will never get that man, woman, gentleman, person, incumbent to put down the hammer and pick up a cup of coffee and have a conversation. Yeah, so that's my view on this, but I think it should be pursued. I think it's just I think a better option would be the leadership circle, because it also gives you very specific information to work on with the individual and with the group. But that's my 2 cents worth.
Thank you, Lawrence. You've as ever opened up. I can see 3 or 4 possible ways of continuing that part of the conversation, and I'm so tempted to lean into some of them because they're juicy. But I want to see if anybody else has got a thought or a reaction. Martin, you are unmuted, and Zintle, you are unmuted. Zintle, I didn't welcome you to the call. I don't know if you can hear us. I can't see you at the stage. Zintle, are you unmuted because you want to contribute now?
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Actually don't know how I got muted, but
No,
but
that's
it's still
fine.
an
I
opportunity.
don't
Yeah,
want to
nonetheless.
sandbag you.
Cool.
But I'm inviting you to say if you would like to, or you can hand over to Martin.
I can hand over to Martin. Thank you.
Okay.
Sure.
Okay, great. Thank you. Craig, listening to what you were saying and the various steps and whatever, and following on from what Lawrence was saying now also, I think there has been, and this is through many, many years of me being in corporate environments, initially as on the receiving end of performance management conversations, and then on the giving end. There has been such a focus on let's get this process right. So it's HR saying, right, you will meet, you will introduce each other. And I'm sorry, but my initial reaction was, that's bullshit. This is my manager. Why do I have to introduce myself? Okay. But sorry, excuse my language. But that's how HR perceived this should be done. And it immediately sets a tone for what is performance management. And a lot of what then comes out of it is how do we sustain it? I had an opportunity, I read a book by a guy called Captain Michael Abrashoff. He wrote a book called It's Your Ship. Okay. He took over a US Navy ship as the new captain. As he walked on board, they booed, the entire crew booed the old captain off the ship. And he said he was horrified because, in terms of respecting your superiors, this was absolutely the worst that could have happened. And he then started talking to various members, obviously, initially, the senior members of the crew, to find out what was so bad that they had booed the existing captain off the ship. And he picked up more and more performance issues. I'll use one example. He spoke to the guy in charge of the galley, the kitchen. 3 times a day, 3 meals a day, this guy had to cook for something like 600 or 700 people. It was a big ship. And generally, everybody agreed the food was atrocious. When he investigated this, speaking to the head chef said, well, that's what the Navy gives us. I've never had training as a chef. And this comes back to your son saying, this is the best of what I can do. So he said, well, let's take all the constraints away. What would you like to do? He said, I'd love to go for some professional training, and I'd love to be able to buy a lot more fresh produce, etc., which the captain then enabled. So he sent him off to a culinary school in France when they docked at a harbor there. He told the Navy, we're no longer buying supplies from your stores, and therefore started a performance improvement just as far as food was concerned. And I think with that obviously affected every single member on board the ship, because everybody noticed, hey, the food is getting much better. We've got food that actually tastes like something. So coming back to your, we don't want to call people managers. In this case, the manager was the captain. So yes. He was the guy right at the top, in charge. And what he said was law on the ship. In the end, of course, it turned around because they were now the best performing ship in the entire US Navy. So wherever there was conflict globally, their ship was called up. And eventually, he said it became such a problem that his crew hadn't had shore leave for 18 months. And he then turned around and said to the Navy, no more. This is it. We are now on strike. My entire ship has shut down for 3 weeks while everybody goes home. So it was incredibly powerful, the kind of role that this very senior person was performing in terms of how do we influence performance. And it wasn't about the conversation as such, but it was about what is the practical implication of how are we going to improve. And I think, yeah, maybe coming back to this, everything we do, we realize there's something wrong with how it's being done. But because we love routine and we're comfortable with what we're doing, we tend to favor keeping the same routine instead of quite boldly stepping out and saying, let's forget about this routine. How can we actually improve it? Sorry, Luyanda, it was called It's Your Ship, by Captain Michael Abrashoff. I'll put it in the chat a bit later. So, Craig, I don't know if that's how that sort of reacts or reflects on what some of the other people are thinking. But I think to me what is so important is let's move away from this negative thing of what is a performance management conversation, but say, how do we actually manage your performance? How do we manage our department's performance? What can we do to improve? And then to drive that. I mean, another example I'm thinking now is the guy who's currently taken over in charge in South Africa of correctional services. I was reading now, he's just started in every single prison planting vegetables again. They're starting to become self-subsistent in their prisons again. He's built bakeries. The prisoners are now baking their own bread. And I thought, wow, this is one man who's taken performance and has had call it the courage, to step forward and say, let's make a performance difference here. All right. Thank you. But I really enjoyed your presentation. Thanks. Well, lots of very, very good points.
Thank you, Martin. And I'm glad that so far it's triggered thoughts for you and triggered thoughts for Lawrence. Dumisani, Luyanda, what's coming up for you? What does it trigger anything for you guys?
Hi guys. I think for me, Craig, I want to repeat what has already been said, because initially my question was, if well, yes, performance management is a challenge, but what we need to do is to move towards, I was even thinking about saying performance management actually needs to be a culture of an organization. I remember a project we did at Home Affairs when we were looking at their ID situation, where people were holding employees of Home Affairs into ransom at gunpoint because they didn't get the ID. One of the things that we discovered there was the fact that actually people were doing as they please in terms of the employees, and there was no what you call management or a sense of accountability and responsibility on the part of the employees that were performing their functions. Simple thing, when we went in the head office here in Pretoria, went outside the building of Home Affairs, you, most especially now, I think even that time it was winter time, you will find employees basking in the sun, not in their desk, not in their offices. And when you get to the office and ask, where's Craig? Then they'll say, oh no, look, there's his office, the lights are on in his office. His jacket is there, which means he's around. But nobody knew where Craig was, while Craig was outside basking in the sun. And what we did, just to cut the long story short, what we did there was basically to look at the whole value chain from the point of people taking fingerprint, from the point where people enter the Home Affairs office up to a point where a new ID is issued. And we find that the guy who was doing fingerprints was actually saying, I'm processing 20 a day. And we say, why 20? He said, no, the previous guy was only doing 10. So I've improved. And that guy, I think not even today, I think it was 5 or 10 years ago, what he was saying, going back to him again, he's now, with the thing being digitized and all that thing, he's now actually processing 200 and something, 500 and something forms within a space of the morning shift, which is basically from 8 to tea time. And what we found is basically what Martin was talking about, is that linking performance to actually what people are doing. Because what we did in that particular exercise was to divide the groups that were in Home Affairs doing this processing of IDs, and let them have their simple thing like a flip chart where they basically indicate how many they process a day and stuff like that. And then the teams started competing amongst each other, started sharing information. So if you base performance on the practical improvement of what people are doing at that point in time, because when you were talking about the workshop in your presentation, I was thinking, where are the employees in this particular setup? It involves, yes, preparing managers to be able to basically do the stuff and whatever, but I think it is important actually to think about the whole ecosystem that is involved in that what you want to basically improve, and make that ecosystem to be participant in the actual improvement, rather than talking about how can we improve. Is to say, this is where we are. Do we like what we are doing at the moment? People, they know when they're doing work of poor quality. They're the one who speak about it. They also even indicate what are the constraints in terms of probably the environment and what has. So the whole ecosystem, like even today, if you think about it, Craig, I've just applied for my passport, get a new passport and whatever. Those guys are the ones that we're working with. And at that point in time, it was taking almost a month or some kind of weeks to get a passport. I applied on Friday. I got my a notice on Wednesday the following week to say, come and collect your passport. Okay, I was no longer going to Home Affairs to find out where is my passport ready. No, I had what you call an SMS. This says, I'm here to collect my passport. And that was the thing that happened. So I think the shift that Lawrence and Martin is talking about is exactly what we should be moving towards, because this thing of taking people away from the system and preparing them and what have you. Yes, while it works in some other time, I think for me, it's not a question of either or. It's both. It's the whole philosophy of Wellesley Academy to say it's not bad, but and, So let us look at integrating both, because yes, you need to put a structure in order to help people, but at the same time, they need to see whatever you're doing practically producing different results. And when I go to that guy now, I talked to him, he said he's about to retire now. He just beamed with laughter, because when we got to him in the first, the level of resistance, and also trying to prove that this thing actually is, as you are saying in terms of your son, he's doing the best of what he could do. Today, he's telling me, Dumisani, I want this thing actually to be a matter of 2 to 3 days. You get your ID, you get your passport, because we've got your information in the system. There's nothing that should be delaying that. So yeah, for me, I think those were the issues that say it's not either or, it's both. But also secondly, is that we need to be very clear. What do we mean when we talk about reframing performance management? What does that entail? What are the issues that are involved in the reframing, so that at least then we are clear of what it is that we are doing. Otherwise, then we're still going to be doing the piecemeal rather than looking at the whole ecosystem.
Guys, Jimmy, Sani, Martin, Lawrence, I would have liked to bring Leon in, but we're running out of time, and Zintle, we're running out of time. I want to honor the fact that we're wrapping up at 9:30 or 10:30, whatever the time is. But I want to reflect for a second. There's consensus, at least, that performance conversations matter. We know that they're inevitable. Even if they've got the worst system, whether HR is forcing it on you or you are a bad leader, you're still talking to somebody else about whether they have put the nail in straight or not. We know that most managers are not naturally good at performance conversations, whether they're technically oriented or whatever the case may be. And this is such an obvious space, I think, and just by using the PsychCap workshop outline, we had our own conversation that, to my mind, moved from hopelessness to hope, from failure to stories of success. And that builds our own resilience and optimism. I mean, we're talking about the Department of Home Affairs that many South Africans wrote off as yet another example of things can never work. Well, you know, wake up, brothers, because it's working beautifully. And people who work there are imagining that it could get even better. I love the fact that the stories are about the work itself. I love the fact that when we think about the work, whether it's the chef who's cooking for people on a ship, or a Department of Home Affairs person who's processing identity applications, when we think about the work, we're able to reimagine performance. Jimmy reminding us that we should not just think about that with the managers, but think about it with the affected employees. I think Lawrence reminds us that if you recruit badly, you're in trouble. But, you know, in the presentation at the beginning, we talked about two kinds of care for the work and care for people. And it seems that those technical managers at least care for the work. We have something to build on. They care for the standards, maybe, of the cooking or the standards of the identity document process. And there is something there that's going to improve things. We just like them to do it in a healthy way. We'd like them to do it in a more human way, maybe. But at least you've got something to work with. Yeah, and then this structural problem, you know, I don't have enough time. I don't have enough hands on deck. I don't have enough food of the right kind from the Navy store. I don't have the right system. And then it's one action to structurally enable, to create the space, create the time, or create the possibility that that chef could get a training course and could get. But what is that piece of magic that just moves this conversation from can't to stories of the most desired ship or the most impressive government department now being Home Affairs? So, guys, performance management matters. You've given me lots to think about, and I appreciate you for that. And hopefully anybody who's watching the video also something to think about. In the theme of practical management next month, June moves to strategy and action. Obviously, this is related. You can't think about performance unless you are thinking about strategic goals and objectives, and you can't put strategy into action without working on performance. So we'll be playing with ideas next month about what changes in the actual work, how do managers translate strategy into structural things like meetings and priorities and teams focuses. Why do we remain structurally loyal to yesterday's strategy? Why do we cling on to stuff that doesn't work? And so on. I appreciate all of you for showing up today. Invite some friends next month, and let's continue this inquiry into practical management. Liesl, you can close out the recording, and to everybody else, hope to see you soon. Email us if you want to continue the conversation or if you need any help from us.